Hello, my friend, and welcome. Tonight, we are going to travel back together slowly, gently into the deep folds of history. Let your shoulders sink into the pillow. Let your breath grow long and even. There is nowhere else you need to be. There is nothing else you need to do. Just listen and drift as we walk together through one of the most important stories of the modern world, the story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the final chapter of the Second World War. This is a long story, my friend, a very long story told across many nights in 30 gentle chapters. We will move slowly. We will not rush. If you fall asleep before the end of tonight's chapter, that is perfectly all right. The story will still be here tomorrow, waiting for you, patient as the tide. So settle in now. Close your eyes if you like, and let us begin at the very beginning, long before the bombs, long before the war, in a quiet island nation at the edge of the Pacific Ocean. Chapter 1: The World Before the Storm. Our story begins not with fire, but with water, with the gray-green waves of the Pacific Ocean lapping against the shores of an island nation called Japan. For centuries, Japan had lived apart from much of the world, closed off by its own choice, ruled by shoguns and samurai, its rice paddies terraced into green hillsides, its cities built of wood and paper, its people bound by ancient codes of honor and duty. For more than 200 years, under the Tokugawa shogunate, Japan kept itself almost entirely sealed from foreign influence. Dutch traders were permitted a small foothold on a tiny island near Nagasaki, and that was nearly all. The rest of the world moved on without Japan's participation. Empires rose in Europe, industry roared to life in England, and across the ocean, a young nation called the United States began to stretch itself from coast to coast. Then, in the summer of 1853, 4 black ships appeared on the horizon near Tokyo Bay. They were not sailing ships, but steamships, belching dark smoke into the sky, bristling with cannon. They belonged to the United States Navy, commanded by Commodore Matthew Perry, and they had come with a message, backed by the unmistakable threat of force. Japan must open itself to trade with the outside world. The shock of Perry's arrival rippled through Japanese society like a stone dropped into a still pond. Here was proof, undeniable and frightening, that the rest of the world had grown powerful in ways Japan had not. The old order could not stand against modern cannon and steam engines. Something had to change. And change it did. Within a few years, the shogunate that had ruled Japan for centuries collapsed, and in 1868 a new government rose in its place, gathered around the young Emperor Meiji. This event is remembered as the Meiji Restoration, and it set Japan on an extraordinary path. In just a few decades, Japan transformed itself from a feudal, agrarian society into a modern industrial and military power, determined never again to be humiliated by foreign gunboats. The Japanese leaders studied the West with great intensity. They sent students to Germany to learn about armies, to Britain to learn about navies, to the United States to learn about railroads and industry. They built factories. They built shipyards. They built a modern conscript army and a modern navy, modeled on the very nations that had once frightened them into submission. But modernization was only part of the story. Japan's leaders looked at the map of the world and saw something troubling. China, once the great power of Asia, had been carved up and humiliated by European empires. India belonged to Britain. Indochina belonged to France. The Dutch held the East Indies. To the leaders of Meiji Japan, there seemed to be only 2 roles available in this world: to be an empire or to be devoured by one. So Japan chose to become an empire. In 1894 and 1895, Japan fought and defeated Qing China in a short, sharp war, gaining control of Taiwan and influence over Korea. It was the first sign that this small island nation intended to be taken seriously on the world stage. Then, in 1904 and 1905, Japan did something that stunned the entire world. It fought a war against Russia, one of the great powers of Europe, and won. A Japanese fleet annihilated the Russian Navy at the Battle of Tsushima. For the first time in the modern era, An Asian nation had defeated a European power in open war. Japan's status as a rising empire was now undeniable. Over the following decades, Japan's ambitions grew alongside its power. In 1910, Japan formally annexed Korea, ruling it as a colony. Japanese industry expanded rapidly. Japanese cities grew crowded with factories and railways. And within the Japanese military, a powerful current of thought began to take hold. The belief that Japan's destiny was to lead Asia, to free it from Western colonial powers, and to secure for itself the resources it lacked: oil, rubber, iron, and rice. Japan is a nation of mountains and narrow coastal plains, my friend, with very little farmland and almost no oil or mineral wealth of its own. Its leaders became increasingly convinced that true security and greatness could only come through empire, through controlling the resource-rich lands of the Asian mainland. This belief would guide Japan's path for the next 40 years, and it would eventually lead to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, though of course, no one could see that terrible destination yet. The First World War came and went, and Japan, fighting on the side of Britain and its allies, gained new territories in the Pacific once held by Germany with barely any cost to itself. Japan's confidence grew, its navy grew, its appetite grew. Then came the year 1931, a turning point on the long road to war. In Manchuria, a vast region of northeastern China rich in coal and iron, officers of Japan's own army, acting without full authorization from the government in Tokyo, staged an explosion on a railway line and blamed it on Chinese saboteurs. This was later called the Mukden Incident, and it was, in truth, a manufactured pretext. Using this excuse, the Japanese army seized control of the entire region and established a puppet state called Manchukuo. The civilian government in Tokyo was troubled by this act of military aggression carried out without its permission, but it found itself unable to rein in its own army. This was one of the great tragedies of pre-war Japan, a slow slide in which the military, and particularly its more radical younger officers, gained more and more power over the elected government, often through intimidation, and sometimes through outright political violence and assassination. Prime ministers who spoke of restraint were murdered. Generals who spoke of conquest were celebrated. Bit by bit, the voices of caution in Japan fell silent, and the voices of expansion grew louder. By the mid-1930s, Japan had left the League of Nations rather than accept international criticism of its actions in Manchuria. It had signed agreements drawing it closer to Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, nations that shared its contempt for the existing international order. And in 1937, full-scale war broke out between Japan and China, beginning with a clash near Beijing at the Marco Polo Bridge, and rapidly spiraling into a brutal and devastating conflict across the Chinese mainland. That war in China would grind on for 8 long years, filled with immense suffering for the Chinese people, including the horrific events in the city of Nanjing in the winter of 1937, when Japanese soldiers killed enormous numbers of civilians and prisoners of war in a matter of weeks. The world watched with growing alarm. Newspapers in America and Britain carried reports of the violence. Public opinion in the United States, already uneasy about Japan's ambitions, began to harden. And so, my friend, as the 1930s drew to their close, the pieces were already falling into place, one by one, like dominoes set up long before anyone would tip the first. Japan needed resources for its war in China. The United States and its allies grew more alarmed and less willing to supply that war. Japan looked toward the resource-rich colonies of Southeast Asia, European possessions weakened by the war now spreading across Europe itself. And an ocean away, in the deserts of the American Southwest, and in quiet university laboratories, scientists were beginning to whisper about a strange new possibility hidden deep within the atom. A possibility that, at this point in our story, still belonged only to the realm of theory. Rest now, my friend, if you feel your eyelids growing heavy. We have only taken our first steps together tonight, out of many. In our next chapter, We will follow the road as it narrows further, toward embargoes, toward ultimatums, toward a Sunday morning in December, and a naval base called Pearl Harbor. Chapter 2: The Road to Pearl Harbor. Welcome back, my friend. Settle in again, just as you did before. Let the blankets hold you. Let the room grow soft and dim around you. Tonight we continue exactly where we left off, in the closing years of the 1930s, as the world edges ever closer to a war that will touch nearly every corner of the globe. By 1940, Europe was already burning. Germany had conquered Poland, then Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France in a series of shocking victories. Britain stood alone against Hitler, its cities under nightly bombardment. And in Asia, Japan looked at this collapse of the European empires and saw, not tragedy but opportunity. France had fallen, yet its colony of French Indochina, rich in rice and rubber, still remained, now defended by a weak and isolated colonial government with no help coming from home. In the autumn of 1940, Japanese forces moved into northern Indochina. The following year, in the summer of 1941, they moved into the south as well, placing Japanese troops within striking distance of British Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the American-controlled Philippines. This was the moment when the long, slow drift toward war between Japan and the United States became something closer to a rushing current. The United States had already been growing uneasy about Japan's actions in China for years, and had begun restricting the sale of certain war materials to Japan, including scrap metal and aviation fuel. But the movement into southern Indochina crossed a line that Washington would not tolerate. In late July of 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt authorized a sweeping response. The United States froze all Japanese assets in America and, most critically, imposed a full embargo on oil exports to Japan. Britain and the Dutch government in exile, controlling the oil-rich East Indies, followed suit. This single decision struck at the very heart of Japan's ability to wage war, or even to function as a modern industrial nation. Japan imported roughly 80% of its oil, and the great majority of that oil came from the United States. Without it, Japanese ships could not sail, Japanese planes could not fly, and Japan's war machine, already deeply engaged in China, would grind to a halt within perhaps a year or two. Japan's leaders now faced an agonizing choice, as they understood it. They could withdraw from China and Indochina, submit to American demands, and abandon the empire they had spent decades building, accepting a position of permanent subordination to Western powers. Or they could seize the oil and resources they needed by force, striking south into the Dutch East Indies and British Malaya. Even knowing this would very likely mean war with the United States, whose battleships and fleet sat at anchor in Hawaii, at a base called Pearl Harbor. Through the autumn of 1941, diplomats in Washington and Tokyo continued to talk, searching for some compromise. Some Japanese leaders, including the moderate Prime Minister Konoye, genuinely hoped for a peaceful settlement, perhaps even a personal summit with Roosevelt. But hardliners within the Japanese military, especially the army, viewed any compromise as unacceptable humiliation. In October of 1941, Konoye's government fell and General Hideki Tojo, a firm supporter of the military's position, became prime minister. On November 26, 1941, the American Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, presented Japan with a diplomatic note that came to be called the Hull Note. It called for Japan to withdraw completely from China and Indochina. To Japan's leadership, this demand felt not like a path to peace, but like a demand for total surrender of everything they had built since 1931. In Tokyo, the decision for war was all but finalized. And so, my friend, far out in the Pacific Ocean, a Japanese naval task force of 6 aircraft carriers had already begun steaming eastward in complete radio silence, hidden beneath gray winter skis in the far North Pacific, moving steadily toward the Hawaiian Islands. Its commander was Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. Its mission, planned in great secrecy by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a man who had studied at Harvard and understood American industrial power perhaps better than any other officer in Japan, and who privately feared this war could not truly be won, was to deliver a single, devastating blow against the heart of American naval power in the Pacific, before that power could be brought to bear against Japan's advance into Southeast Asia. On the quiet Sunday morning of December 7, 1941, just before 8 o'clock, the first wave of Japanese aircraft, more than 180 planes, appeared in the skies above Pearl Harbor. Sailors aboard the American battleships below were still eating breakfast, still raising flags for the morning colors, entirely unaware of what was descending upon them. Within less than 2 hours, the attack was over. 4 American battleships were sunk, including the USS Arizona, which exploded and settled to the harbor floor with more than 1,000 sailors still trapped inside her hull. 4 more battleships were damaged. Nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed, most before they ever left the ground. 2,403 Americans were killed that morning, most of them in the span of just a few terrible minutes. The attack was, by every military measure, a stunning tactical success for Japan, but it was also, in a way that would only become clear over the following years, a catastrophic strategic mistake. The following day, December 8th, President Roosevelt stood before Congress and called December 7th, a date which will live in infamy. Congress declared war on Japan almost unanimously. Days later, Germany and Italy, honoring their alliance with Japan, declared war on the United States as well, drawing America fully into the global conflict on both sides of the world. Admiral Yamamoto himself is said to have remarked, in the aftermath of his own great victory, that he feared they had only awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. Whether or not he spoke those exact words, my friend, they would prove to be true beyond anything even he could have imagined. The industrial might of the United States, until that morning still divided and uncertain about entering a foreign war, now turned itself fully and with grim unity toward total war. A war that would not end until, nearly 4 years later, over 2 cities whose names were, in December of 1941, still unknown to almost every American: Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Rest here a while, my friend. The fire has been lit far out in the Pacific, and it will burn for years yet before our story reaches its final, terrible chapters. There is no need to hurry toward that ending tonight. Let your breathing slow. Let the weight of your body sink into the mattress. In our next chapter together, we will watch as the war spreads like wildfire across the islands of the Pacific, from the jungles of the Philippines to the coral atolls whose names would soon become famous: Midway, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima. Chapter 3: Fire Across the Pacific. Welcome back again, my friend. Good. You found your way back to this quiet place. Pull the blanket up a little higher and let your eyes grow heavy again as we pick up our story in the weeks just after Pearl Harbor, when the war in the Pacific had only just begun to spread its wings. In the hours and days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan launched a stunning wave of coordinated assaults across the entire Western Pacific. On the very same day, by the calendar on the other side of the international date line, Japanese forces struck the American-held Philippines, the British colonies of Hong Kong and Malaya, and the tiny American outposts of Guam and Wake Island. It was as though a single vast net had been cast across thousands of miles of ocean all at once. The early months of 1942 brought one Japanese victory after another. Hong Kong fell before Christmas. The great British stronghold of Singapore, thought to be nearly impregnable, surrendered in February, in what Winston Churchill later called the worst disaster in British military history. In the Philippines, American and Filipino forces under General Douglas MacArthur fought a desperate defense on the Bataan Peninsula, but by April they too were forced to surrender, leading to the horror of the Bataan Death March. in which thousands of starved and exhausted prisoners died on a brutal forced march under their captors. By the spring of 1942, Japan controlled an empire stretching from the borders of India in the west to the edges of the mid-Pacific in the east, from the frozen Aleutian Islands in the north to the jungles of New Guinea in the south. It was, by land area, one of the largest empires the world had ever seen, assembled in barely 5 months. To many observers at the time, it must have seemed unstoppable. But America's response was already beginning to take shape, my friend, quietly, and then not so quietly at all. In April of 1942, 16 American B-25 bombers, led by Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, launched from the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Hornet on an audacious raid against Tokyo itself. The military damage done by the Doolittle raid was modest, but its psychological effect was immense. It proved to the Japanese public, who had been told their home islands were untouchable, that the war could reach them too. And it forced Japan's naval command to reconsider its strategy, with consequences that would prove decisive just weeks later. In early May of 1942, Japanese and American naval forces clashed in the Coral Sea, north of Australia, in the first naval battle in history fought entirely by aircraft, with the opposing ships never once sighting one another directly. It ended roughly as a draw, but it halted a planned Japanese invasion of Port Moresby in New Guinea, the first Japanese offensive to be turned back. Then, in June of 1942, came the battle that historians still regard as the true turning point of the entire Pacific War, the Battle of Midway. Admiral Yamamoto planned to lure the remaining American aircraft carriers into a decisive battle near the small atoll of Midway, destroying them once and for all. But American codebreakers had partially cracked Japan's naval codes, and Admiral Chester Nimitz knew almost exactly where and when the Japanese fleet would strike. In the span of just a few minutes, on the morning of June 4, 1942, American dive bombers caught 4 Japanese aircraft carriers with their flight decks crowded with fully fueled and armed aircraft, in the middle of rearming for a second strike. All 4 carriers were set ablaze and eventually sunk, along with irreplaceable aircraft, and most critically for Japan, hundreds of its most experienced pilots. It was a defeat from which the Imperial Japanese Navy would never fully recover. From Midway onward, the strategic initiative in the Pacific slowly but steadily shifted toward the United States and its allies. Beginning in August of 1942, American Marines landed on the small, obscure island of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, beginning a grueling 6-month campaign of jungle warfare, naval battles, and disease that would claim tens of thousands of lives on both sides before the island was finally secured in February of 1943. What followed, my friend, was a long, grinding, island-by-island campaign that came to be known as island hopping. Rather than attacking every Japanese-held island directly, American commanders chose to bypass the most heavily fortified positions, isolating them and starving them of supplies, while capturing a chain of strategically vital islands that brought American bombers ever closer to Japan itself. Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, Guam, Peleliu. Each name represented weeks or months of brutal fighting, often against Japanese defenders who had been ordered, and who largely chose to fight to the last man rather than surrender. This willingness to fight to the death, rather than accept the shame of surrender, was rooted deeply in the military culture that had come to dominate Japan by the 1930s and 1940s, a culture that blended traditional samurai ideals of honor with fierce modern nationalism and reverence for the emperor. American commanders and the young soldiers and Marines under them took careful note of this pattern. On island after island, Japanese garrisons that could have surrendered when their position became hopeless instead launched final suicidal charges, called banzai attacks, or simply fought on in caves and tunnels until they were killed almost to the last man. On Saipan, in the summer of 1944, some Japanese civilians, terrified by propaganda claiming Americans would torture and kill them, threw themselves from cliffs rather than be captured. This pattern, repeated again and again across dozens of islands, would weigh very heavily on American military planning in 1945, my friend, as the war drew closer and closer to the Japanese home islands themselves. If small, remote islands could be defended with such ferocity, and at such terrible cost in lives on both sides, what might the invasion of Japan's own homeland require? That question, quiet and terrible, was already beginning to form in the minds of American planners, even as our story tonight has only reached the middle years of the war. Rest now if you need to, my friend. We have crossed the wide waters of the Pacific together tonight, island by island. In our next chapter, we will turn our eyes toward a different kind of battlefield entirely, not of jungles and beaches, but of blackboards, laboratories, and desert test sites, where a small group of scientists were beginning to unlock one of the deepest secrets of the physical universe. Chapter 4: The Secret in the Atom. Hello again, my friend. I am glad you have come back to this quiet room with me. Tonight our story turns away from the battlefields for a while and moves instead into quiet laboratories, chalk-dusted blackboards, and the private, troubled thoughts of scientists. Let your body settle again into stillness, and let your mind drift along with the story. Our tale here begins not in America, but in Europe, in the years just before the war, when physicists across the continent were beginning to understand the strange inner structure of the atom. In late 1938, in Berlin, two chemists named Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann conducted an experiment in which they bombarded uranium with neutrons and found, to their confusion, that the uranium seemed to split into lighter elements. Their colleague, the physicist Lise Meitner, who had fled Nazi Germany because she was Jewish, worked out the explanation together with her nephew Otto Frisch while walking in the snowy woods of Sweden over the winter holidays. The uranium nucleus, she realized, was splitting apart, releasing a tremendous burst of energy in the process. She called this process nuclear fission. Word of this discovery spread quickly through the small, close-knit world of physicists, many of whom were refugees from fascist Europe, now living in Britain and the United States. They understood almost immediately what fission might make possible if certain conditions could be met. A chain reaction, in which the splitting of one uranium atom released neutrons that split further atoms, releasing more neutrons still, multiplying almost instantly into a release of energy many, many times greater than any explosive yet known to humanity. The frightening thought that followed naturally from this insight was that Nazi Germany, home to some of the world's finest physicists and chemists, might already be working towards such a weapon. In the summer of 1939, the physicist Leo Szilard, a Hungarian refugee, drafted a letter of warning and persuaded Albert Einstein, the most famous scientist alive, to sign it and send it to President Roosevelt. The letter warned that a new type of extremely powerful bomb might be constructed and urged the American government to begin its own research before Germany could get there first. At first, the American government's response was slow and modest, a small research committee with limited funding. But as the war intensified, and as British scientists shared their own more urgent and advanced research, showing that a working bomb might require a far smaller amount of uranium than first believed, the American effort accelerated dramatically. In 1942, it was reorganized under the control of the United States Army Corps of Engineers, under the command of General Leslie Groves, a blunt, driven engineer who had just finished overseeing the construction of the Pentagon. The project was given a deliberately vague and unremarkable name, drawn from its early offices in Manhattan, the Manhattan Project. Groves needed a brilliant scientific mind to lead the actual physics and engineering work of designing a bomb, and he chose a somewhat unlikely figure, J. Robert Oppenheimer, a lean, intense theoretical physicist from Berkeley, known for his broad intellectual interests, his ability to master nearly any subject quickly, and his skill at bringing brilliant, difficult people together into effective teams. Oppenheimer proposed building a secret, self-contained laboratory in a remote location where the finest scientific minds could live and work together in isolation, and Groves agreed. They chose a windswept plateau in the high desert of New Mexico, the site of a small boys' school called Los Alamos. What followed, my friend, was one of the most extraordinary scientific and industrial undertakings in human history. At its peak, the Manhattan Project employed more than 130,000 people, working across secret sites scattered around the country: uranium enrichment facilities in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, plutonium production reactors in Hanford, Washington, and the design laboratory itself at Los Alamos, where the world's leading physicists, many still in their 20s and 30s, worked around the clock on problems no human being had ever solved before. The total cost, by the time the project was complete, was roughly $2 billion, an almost unimaginable sum for the time, spent in nearly total secrecy, hidden even from most members of Congress and from Vice President Harry Truman himself. The scientists at Los Alamos pursued two different paths toward a bomb at once, unsure which would succeed first. One path used uranium-235, a rare isotope that had to be painstakingly separated from far more common uranium-238 using enormous, electricity-hungry facilities at Oak Ridge. The other path used plutonium, an entirely artificial element that did not exist in nature, produced in nuclear reactors at Hanford by bombarding uranium with neutrons. The uranium bomb design was relatively simple, essentially firing one piece of uranium into another to trigger a chain reaction, so simple that scientists believed it would work without ever needing to test it first. The plutonium bomb required a far more complex design, called implosion, in which conventional explosives arranged in a precise sphere would compress a plutonium core evenly from all sides at once, an approach so uncertain that the scientists insisted on testing it before anyone would trust it to work in battle. By the summer of 1945, both paths had reached their conclusion, and so, in the pre-dawn darkness of July 16, 1945, in a remote stretch of New Mexico desert called the Jornada del Muerto, the Journey of the Dead Man, the world's first nuclear explosion was set to take place. The test was given the code name Trinity, a name Oppenheimer himself chose, reportedly inspired by the poetry of John Donne. At precisely 5:29 in the morning, the plutonium implosion device detonated atop a 100-foot steel tower. Witnesses, watching from bunkers miles away through darkened glass, described a light brighter than many suns, a fireball that turned the desert night briefly into brilliant day, followed by a rising column of boiling cloud, and finally, long seconds later, a shockwave and roar that rolled across the desert like the end of the world. The tower itself was almost entirely vaporized. Sand at the blast site was fused into a strange greenish glass, later named trinitite. Oppenheimer later said that in that moment, a line from the ancient Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, rose unbidden in his mind. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Kenneth Bainbridge, the test's director, turned to Oppenheimer just afterward and said, more simply and perhaps more truthfully, "Now we are all sons of bitches." The Trinity test proved, beyond any remaining doubt, that a functioning atomic weapon now existed in the world, with an explosive force later estimated at around 20,000 tons of TNT, more than 1,000 times more powerful than the largest conventional bombs then in use. News of the successful test was rushed by coded telegram to President Truman, who was at that very moment in the German city of Potsdam, meeting with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin to decide the shape of the post-war world, and to decide, among many other things, what to do about a war in the Pacific that showed no sign of ending on its own. Rest now, my friend, here in the quiet after that terrible desert dawn. The device now existed. What remained undecided in the summer of 1945 was only this: where and against whom and under what circumstances it might be used. That is where our next chapter will take us. For now, let this new and heavy knowledge settle quietly in the back of your mind, the way a stone settles slowly to the bottom of a still lake, and let yourself rest. Chapter 5: Potsdam and the Weight of a Decision. Welcome back, my friend. You are doing so well simply by being here, breathing slowly, letting this long story carry you gently towards sleep. Tonight we travel to a lakeside palace in occupied Germany, in the middle of the summer of 1945, where the fate of the war's final chapter was quietly being decided. By July of 1945, the war in Europe had already ended. Germany had surrendered in early May, following Hitler's suicide in his Berlin bunker, and the once mighty Nazi state lay in ruins. But in the Pacific, the war against Japan raged on, seemingly without end. American forces had, by this point, fought their way through the Mariana Islands, through the Philippines, and through two of the most costly battles of the entire war: Iwo Jima in February and March of 1945, and Okinawa from April through June of that same year. Okinawa, in particular, cast a long and troubling shadow over everything that followed. It was the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War, and the fighting there lasted nearly 3 months. Approximately 12,000 American servicemen were killed, along with more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers, and most tragically, perhaps as many as 100,000 Okinawan civilians, many of whom died in mass suicides encouraged by Japanese propaganda and military coercion, or were caught in the crossfire of the fighting. Kamikaze pilots, flying aircraft deliberately loaded with explosives to crash into American ships, sank or damaged dozens of vessels during the battle, a grim preview of the resistance and invasion of the Japanese home islands itself might provoke. It was against this backdrop that American military planners had already begun drawing up Operation Downfall, the code name for a planned invasion of Japan itself, expected to begin in November of 1945, with landings on the southern island of Kyushu, followed by a much larger invasion of the main island of Honshu in early 1946. Estimates of the potential casualties for such an invasion varied enormously and remain debated by historians to this day. But virtually all military planners at the time expected the fighting to be extraordinarily costly, potentially exceeding the casualties of every previous Pacific battle combined, given Japan's demonstrated willingness to resist to the last soldier and to mobilize its civilian population, including women and children being trained to fight with sharpened bamboo spears, for a final defense of the homeland. It was in this atmosphere of grim calculation that President Harry Truman, along with Winston Churchill, representing Britain, and Joseph Stalin, representing the Soviet Union, met at the Cecilienhof Palace in Potsdam, Germany, in July of 1945, to discuss the shape of the post-war world and the final defeat of Japan. Truman had become president only in April of that year, following the sudden death of Franklin Roosevelt, and had only just been fully informed about the existence of the atomic bomb program days after taking office. He arrived at Potsdam still learning the full weight of the responsibility that had fallen so unexpectedly upon him. It was during this conference, on July 16th, that Truman received word of the successful Trinity test in the New Mexico desert. The news transformed the atmosphere of the negotiations. Truman later described feeling a new sense of confidence in his dealings with Stalin, now that he knew, in his words, of a weapon of unprecedented and terrible power. On July 26, 1945, the United States, Britain, and China issued a joint ultimatum to Japan, known as the Potsdam Declaration. It called for Japan's unconditional surrender, promised the complete demilitarization and eventual democratic reconstruction of Japan under Allied occupation, and warned in stark and deliberately vague language that the alternative to surrender would be, in the declaration's own words, prompt and utter destruction. Notably, the declaration did not explicitly mention the atomic bomb, nor did it offer any guarantee regarding the fate of the Japanese emperor, a point that mattered enormously to Japan's leadership. In Tokyo, the response to the Potsdam Declaration was fractured and uncertain. Some members of the Japanese government were quietly exploring the possibility of a negotiated peace, working through diplomatic channels with the still neutral Soviet Union, hoping the Soviets might act as mediators, or at the very least, hoping to secure terms less humiliating than unconditional surrender, and above all hoping to preserve the position of the emperor, whom most Japanese regarded as a living, sacred figure. But Japan's military leadership remained committed to fighting on, believing that a bloody defense of the homeland might yet extract better surrender terms from a war-weary allied public, or even achieve an unlikely victory. Prime Minister Kentaro Suzuki, under pressure to respond publicly to the Potsdam Declaration, used a Japanese word, mokusatsu, in his reply to reporters, a word that carries an ambiguous range of meanings, from no comment to something closer to treating with silent contempt. This ambiguous response was interpreted in Washington, rightly or wrongly, as an outright rejection of the ultimatum. Back in the United States, meanwhile, plans were already well underway for the atomic bomb's use, should Japan fail to surrender. In April and May of 1945, a target committee composed of military officers and scientists had met repeatedly to select possible cities for the bomb's use. Their criteria were specific and, in their own cold way, calculated for maximum demonstrative effect. The target should be a city of significant military or industrial importance, large enough that the bomb's power could be clearly and unmistakably demonstrated, and critically, a city that had not already been heavily damaged by the extensive conventional firebombing campaign the United States Army Air Forces had been conducting against Japanese cities throughout the spring of 1945, so that the effects of this new weapon could be measured and understood without confusion from prior destruction. Several cities appeared on early lists, including Kokura, Niigata, and Kyoto. Kyoto, Japan's ancient former capital, and a city of immense cultural and historical significance, was in fact the initial first choice of General Groves, but it was removed from the target list, according to most historical accounts, at the personal insistence of Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who had visited Kyoto years earlier and deeply admired its cultural treasures, and who feared that destroying such a revered city would create lasting, unnecessary bitterness that could complicate the post-war occupation and reconstruction of Japan. In its place, a city on the southern main island of Honshu rose to the top of the list. Hiroshima, a regional military and industrial center of roughly 350,000 people, home to a major Japanese army headquarters, ringed by hills that military planners believed might focus and amplify the bomb's blast effects, and a city that had, notably, largely escaped the conventional bombing raids that had already devastated Tokyo and dozens of other Japanese cities, some say deliberately preserved for this very purpose. Rest now, my friend, if the weight of this chapter has grown heavy in your chest. It is all right to feel that weight. This is one of the most difficult passages in our long story together. We are drawing close now, closer than we have ever been, to the morning of August 6th, 1945. In our next chapter, before we arrive at that morning, we will pause together in the city of Hiroshima itself, as it existed in those last quiet days, so that we might understand not just the weapon and not just the strategy, but the ordinary human lives that filled that city's streets, markets, schoolyards, and homes. Chapter 6, A City Called Hiroshima. Hello again, my friend. Come back with me now gently to a city on the delta of the Oda River, where 6 streams braid their way toward the Seto Inland Sea. Let your breathing slow to match the slow pace of this story, and let me tell you about Hiroshima as it was before the world ever learned its name. Hiroshima, in the summer of 1945, was a city of roughly 350,000 people, though its population had swelled somewhat with soldiers and workers, and shrunk somewhat as children were evacuated to the countryside for safety. It was built across a fan-shaped delta of small islands connected by dozens of bridges, its wide, calm rivers reflecting the summer sky. It was a city with a long history, founded in the 16th century around a castle built by the feudal Lord Mori Terremoto, its castle keep still standing after more than 300 years, a black-walled tower rising above the rooftops near the city center. By the 20th century, Hiroshima had grown into an important regional hub, a city of shipbuilding, light industry, and commerce, and significantly, a major center of Japanese military activity. It was home to the headquarters of the Second General Army, responsible for the defense of all of southern Japan, and to a large military garrison, along with supply depots and communication centers that supported Japan's war effort across the Pacific and Asia. This military significance was precisely why the Target Committee had placed it near the top of its list. Yet Hiroshima was, above all, a city of ordinary people living ordinary lives, even in the exhausted final months of a long war. There were streetcars running along the main avenues, carrying office workers and schoolchildren. There were open-air markets selling what food could be found in a nation increasingly strained by wartime shortages. There were wooden houses with tiled roofs, packed closely together along narrow lanes, and larger buildings of brick and reinforced concrete near the city center. There were schools, hospitals, temples, and a bustling downtown shopping district called Nakajima, near the T-shaped AA bridge that arched gracefully over the river. Life in Hiroshima, like life across all of Japan by the summer of 1945, had grown increasingly difficult. Food was rationed and often scarce. Many men of fighting age were away in the military, some already dead in battles across the Pacific, whose names their families might never even learn. School children, including young teenagers, had been mobilized into labor service, working to clear fire breaks throughout the city, wide swaths where buildings were demolished to prevent fires from spreading in the event of an incendiary bombing raid, the kind that had already devastated Tokyo, Osaka, and dozens of other Japanese cities earlier that year. Indeed, many residents of Hiroshima had grown quietly uneasy about their city's continued good fortune. Other major Japanese cities had suffered terrible destruction from American B-29 bombing raids since the spring, yet Hiroshima, month after month, remained largely untouched, its downtown streets and old wooden neighborhoods still intact. Rumors circulated that the Americans were deliberately sparing the city for some unknown reason, perhaps because so many Hiroshima natives had emigrated to the United States before the war. Some speculated, or perhaps the city was simply being saved for something worse. Air raid sirens sounded from time to time as American reconnaissance and weather planes passed overhead, but no bombs had yet fallen in significant numbers. On the morning of August 6, 1945, Hiroshima woke to clear summer skies. It was a Monday. Children gathered for morning assembly at their schools. Office workers began their commutes. Soldiers at the Second General Army headquarters went about their morning routines. At around 7 in the morning, an air raid alert had briefly sounded, as it often did, when a single American weather reconnaissance plane passed over the city to check conditions, then departed. The all-clear was given shortly afterward. Many residents, weary of frequent false alarms, paid it little mind and continued about their morning. They had no way of knowing, my friend, that far above them, a single American B-29 bomber named the Enola Gay, named by its pilot, Colonel Paul Tibbets, after his own mother, was already approaching the city, carrying inside its bomb bay a single weapon unlike any that had ever been used in the history of warfare. Aboard the plane were 12 crew members, most of whom knew only that they carried something powerful and secret. Only a handful fully understood the true nature of what they carried. It is important, I think, my friend, as we sit together in this quiet moment before the story turns terrible, to remember that everything I have just described to you, the streetcars, the schoolchildren, the market stalls, the old castle, the bridges over the calm river, all of it existed, real and ordinary and full of human life, right up until the very instant our next chapter begins. Chapter 7, 8:15 in the morning. My friend, before we go further, take a slow breath with me, in and out. This next part of our story is heavy, but I will carry it gently and speak of it softly, the way one speaks of something sacred and sad at once. You do not need to hold on to every detail. Just let the story wash over you like water over stones. At 8:15 in the morning, local time, on August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay released its single bomb, which had been given the name Little Boy, from an altitude of roughly 31,000 feet above Hiroshima. The bomb fell for just under a minute, tumbling through clear morning air, before detonating at an altitude of approximately 1,900 feet above the city, almost directly above a hospital near the center of Hiroshima. Close to the distinctive T-shaped AA bridge that had been used as the aiming point. The explosion released energy equivalent to approximately 15,000 tons of TNT, born from the fission of less than a kilogram of uranium-235, out of the roughly 64 kilograms carried within the weapon. In the span of a fraction of a second, a fireball formed at the detonation point with a temperature at its core estimated to have exceeded 1 million degrees Celsius, far hotter than the surface of the sun. Beneath that fireball, the city of Hiroshima simply ceased to exist across a wide area. Within a radius of roughly 1 mile from the point of detonation, nearly every building was flattened or consumed by fire in an instant. People near the center of the blast were killed so quickly and so completely that some left behind only shadows, burned by the intense flash of thermal radiation into stone steps and walls, the faint outline of a person who had been sitting there just a moment before, now gone entirely. This is one of the most haunting physical traces left by the bomb, my friend, and museums in Hiroshima preserve some of these shadow stains to this day. The thermal flash, traveling at the speed of light, arrived first, burning exposed skin at distances of over 2 miles, igniting clothing, wood, and paper across the city almost instantaneously. Moments later, the blast wave arrived, a wall of compressed air moving faster than the speed of sound near the center of the explosion, flattening buildings, hurling debris, and causing catastrophic injuries even at considerable distances from the epicenter or hypocenter, as it is more precisely called for an airburst. Of the roughly 350,000 people in Hiroshima that morning, it is estimated that approximately 70,000 were killed instantly or within the first day, with tens of thousands more dying over the following weeks and months from burns, injuries, and the mysterious, terrifying illness that would soon be understood as acute radiation sickness. By the end of 1945, the death toll from the Hiroshima bombing is estimated to have reached somewhere between 135,000 and 140,000 people, though exact numbers can never be fully known, given the chaos of the moment and the destruction of records. The survivors of the bombing, who would come to be called hibikusha, meaning explosion-affected people, described scenes that defy easy description. A great column of smoke and debris rose above the city in the shape that would become tragically iconic, a mushroom cloud climbing tens of thousands of feet into the summer sky, visible for many miles in every direction. Below it, the city center burned in what survivors described as a firestorm, with winds drawn inward toward the flames with such force that they fanned the fires higher still. Survivors near the edges of the destruction described a world suddenly and inexplicably ended. Buildings gone, streets unrecognizable, the injured wandering in shock with skin hanging from their arms in sheets, clothing burned away, hair singed from their heads, many walking silently with their arms held out in front of them because the burned skin was too painful to let hang naturally against their bodies. Some survivors later recalled the eerie silence in the moments after the blast, broken only by the crackling of fires and, gradually, by the moans and cries of the wounded and the dying. Dr. Michihiko Hachiya, a physician who survived the bombing and kept a detailed diary of the days that followed, wrote of waking to find his house collapsed around him, his body cut and bleeding, and stumbling out into a landscape he described as resembling nothing he had ever seen, with the sky darkened by smoke and dust, and streams of burned and wounded people moving slowly, silently, away from the city center toward the rivers, seeking water and relief from unbearable heat and thirst. The rivers of Hiroshima, in fact, became a place of terrible refuge and terrible tragedy in the hours after the bombing. Desperately thirsty and burned survivors crowded into the water seeking relief, and many drowned there, too weak to hold themselves above the surface, while others died along the riverbanks in the following hours, their bodies later found in heartbreaking numbers along the water's edge. Within the city, the local medical infrastructure, already strained by wartime shortages, was utterly overwhelmed within minutes. Of Hiroshima's roughly 200 physicians, the great majority were killed or injured in the blast itself, along with the great majority of nurses. Hospitals themselves had been destroyed or badly damaged, including the very hospital nearly beneath the point of detonation. Those doctors and nurses who survived, many of them injured themselves, worked amid the ruins with what little medical supplies could be gathered, facing injuries and radiation symptoms that medical science had never before encountered or needed to treat. Severe burns covering large portions of the body, combined with a strange, delayed illness that would soon begin to reveal itself in the days that followed. My friend, I will not linger longer than I must on the details of that terrible morning. It is enough for tonight to understand its scale and to hold in your heart the ordinary people we spoke of just a chapter ago, the schoolchildren, the office workers, the shopkeepers, who were caught in a single blinding instant within the heart of the first atomic bomb ever used against a human population. Rest now if you can, my friend. Let this heaviness settle slowly like ash drifting down after a fire has passed. In our coming chapters, we will speak of what came next, the strange illness that revealed itself in the days and weeks that followed, the response of Japan's leadership, and the terrible events just 3 days later in a second city to the south, called Nagasaki. But that is for another time. Chapter 8: The Invisible Illness. Welcome back, my friend. Let your body sink again into the softness beneath you. Tonight we continue quietly, in the days just after that terrible morning, as the people of Hiroshima began to understand that the danger had not ended with the blast itself. In the hours and days following the bombing, survivors and rescuers who had entered the city center, believing the danger to be past, began to fall ill in ways that puzzled even the doctors who had themselves survived the blast. People who had seemed only mildly injured or entirely uninjured began to develop strange and frightening symptoms: overwhelming fatigue, nausea, vomiting, bleeding from the gums, purple spots appearing beneath the skin, and hair falling out in clumps. Many who had walked away from the ruins on their own 2 feet, seemingly fine, grew weaker in the days that followed, and died within 1 or 2 weeks of the bombing. This was radiation sickness, though at the time, almost no one, even among the doctors treating it, fully understood what they were witnessing. The bomb had released not only heat and blast force, but also a burst of intense ionizing radiation, invisible and silent, capable of damaging the human body at the cellular level, particularly the rapidly dividing cells of the bone marrow and digestive system. Those exposed to high doses of this radiation, even at some distance from the blast itself, found their bodies slowly losing the ability to produce new blood cells or repair damaged tissue. Japanese physicians, cut off from outside scientific information about atomic weapons, initially struggled even to name what they were seeing. Some suspected a kind of plague or epidemic illness. Dr. Hachiya and his colleagues working amid the ruins of Hiroshima's medical facilities, gradually pieced together the pattern, even without understanding its precise cause, and did what they could with the desperately limited medical supplies available to them. Though for many patients, particularly those who had been close to the hypocenter, there was little that could be done. American military authorities, for their part, were slow to publicly acknowledge the existence or severity of radiation sickness, and for some time after the war, some officials publicly minimized or disputed reports of a lingering radiation illness, a position that added to the confusion and suffering of survivors seeking to understand their own conditions and to receive appropriate care. In Tokyo, meanwhile, the government struggled to understand exactly what had happened in Hiroshima. Communication with the city had gone entirely silent after the bombing. Telegraph and telephone lines were destroyed, and reports reaching the capital in the first hours were fragmentary and difficult to believe. A single bomb, obliterating an entire city in an instant, seemed to strain credulity, even for a government that had absorbed years of increasingly grim wartime news. On August 7th, the day after the bombing, the United States government publicly announced what had happened, revealing to the world for the first time that an atomic bomb, harnessing what President Truman's statement called the basic power of the universe, had been used against Japan, and warning that if Japan did not surrender, its cities could expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. Even with this announcement, Japan's military leadership remained divided and, in significant part, unwilling to accept immediate surrender. Some in the military hierarchy questioned whether the weapon used against Hiroshima had truly been an atomic bomb at all, or suspected exaggeration in the American reports. A Japanese scientific team, including the physicist Yoshio Nishina, who had himself studied nuclear physics before the war, was dispatched to Hiroshima to investigate directly, and confirmed within a day or two that the destruction had indeed been caused by a nuclear weapon, based on the pattern of the damage and detectable radiation. Even this confirmation, however, did not immediately produce a decision to surrender. Japan's Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, sometimes called the Big Six, remained deeply divided between those who favored seeking a negotiated peace and hardliners in the military who continued to argue for continuing the war, believing that a decisive defensive battle on the home island could still improve Japan's negotiating position, whatever the cost, and who in some cases doubted that the United States possessed more than one or two such weapons. Given the enormous industrial effort evidently required to produce even a single bomb. They were not entirely wrong to wonder, my friend, but they were also not given very long at all to reach their own conclusions on the matter. For the United States, even as this debate continued in Tokyo, had already prepared a second weapon and a second target only 3 days away. Rest here for a moment, my friend, in this uneasy pause between two terrible events. Let your breath continue its slow rhythm. In our next chapter, we will travel south to a hillside city built around a natural harbor, a city with its own long history, entirely unaware of what the following days held in store for it. Chapter 9, a city called Nagasaki. Hello again, my friend. Let us travel further south now, along the coast, to a city built around a deep, sheltered harbor on the island of Kyushu. Let your eyes rest closed, and let me describe this place to you, gently, before its own difficult morning arrives in our story. Nagasaki, in the summer of 1945, was a city of roughly 240,000 people, built along steep hillsides surrounding a narrow, picturesque harbor that had made it, for centuries, one of Japan's most important gateways to the outside world. Indeed, Nagasaki held a unique place in Japanese history. During the long centuries of national seclusion, when Japan closed itself off from nearly all foreign contact, a small artificial island called Dejima in Nagasaki Harbor remained the one narrow channel through which Dutch, and for a time Portuguese, traders were permitted limited contact with Japan. Because of this long history, Nagasaki had, more than almost any other Japanese city, absorbed foreign influence over the centuries, including a substantial Christian community dating back to Portuguese missionaries in the 16th century, and later Catholic congregations that had survived periods of brutal persecution to remain a visible part of the city's identity. By 1945, Nagasaki had become an important industrial city, home to major shipyards and armaments factories operated by the Mitsubishi Company, producing torpedoes, ships, and military equipment for Japan's war effort. It was this industrial significance, more than any single military headquarters, that placed Nagasaki onto the list of potential atomic bomb targets, though it had, in fact, ranked below several other cities on the original target list, and became the actual target of the second bomb only through a combination of strategic calculation and, in the end, simple weather. The primary target selected for the second bomb was not Nagasaki at all, but the city of Kokura, home to one of Japan's largest arsenals. On the morning of August 9, 1945, a B-29 bomber named Boxcar, commanded by Major Charles Sweeney, carrying a second atomic weapon nicknamed Fat Man, a bulkier, more complex implosion-designed bomb using plutonium rather than uranium, approached Kokura as planned. But smoke and haze, drifting over the city from conventional bombing raids conducted against a nearby city the day before, obscured the intended target so completely that the bombardier could not achieve the clear visual sighting required by mission orders. After circling the city 3 times, burning precious fuel while Japanese anti-aircraft guns began to find their range, Sweeney made the decision to divert to the secondary target, Nagasaki. The people of Nagasaki, like those of Hiroshima days before, had already endured smaller conventional bombing raids earlier in the war, though the city as a whole had not suffered destruction on the scale of Tokyo or other heavily bombed cities. Life in Nagasaki in early August of 1945 carried the same mixture of wartime hardship and stubborn ordinary routine we spoke of in Hiroshima. Rationed food, mobilized schoolchildren working in factories and clearing fire breaks, families anxiously awaiting news of loved ones serving in the military, and an undercurrent of exhaustion after nearly 4 years of total war. Among the city's population were also several thousand Allied prisoners of war, held in camps near Nagasaki, along with Korean laborers who had been brought to Japan, often forcibly, to work in the city's mines and factories. And it was this same diverse population, Japanese civilians, Christian congregants at worship, schoolchildren, factory workers, and forced laborers alike, who would be caught within the second bomb's terrible reach. When Boxcar arrived over Nagasaki on the afternoon of August 9th, cloud cover over the city was also significant, and fuel was running dangerously low after the diversion from Kokura. With only a brief break in the clouds available, the bombardier released the Fat Man weapon at 11:02 in the morning local time, aiming, due to the limited visibility, not precisely at the city's commercial center as originally intended, but somewhat further north, over the Urakami Valley, an industrial district that was also home to Nagasaki's largest concentration of the city's Catholic community, gathered that morning, as they often were, around the great Urakami Cathedral, one of the largest Catholic churches in East Asia at that time. Rest here for just a moment, my friend, before we continue into what that afternoon would bring. As with Hiroshima, I ask you again to hold in your mind, just briefly, the fullness of ordinary life in this harbor city, its shipyards and hillside neighborhoods, its churches and schoolchildren, its long history as Japan's window to the wider world. All of it still whole, still unbroken in the moments just before our next chapter begins. Chapter 10, 11:02 in the morning. My friend, breathe with me again before we continue. Slowly in, slowly out. We return now to Nagasaki on that clear break in the clouds at 2 minutes past 11 in the morning on August 9, 1945. The Fat Man weapon detonated at an altitude of approximately 1,600 feet above the Urakami Valley, releasing an explosive force estimated at roughly 21,000 tons of TNT, somewhat greater than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima 3 days earlier, owing to its more efficient plutonium implosion design. Because Nagasaki's geography was more hilly and irregular than Hiroshima's flat delta, with ridges and valleys that partially shielded some areas of the city from the direct force of the blast, the overall pattern of destruction was somewhat different, concentrated heavily within the Urakami Valley itself, while portions of the city center, shielded by intervening hills, suffered comparatively less severe damage, though still substantial. Within the Urakami Valley, however, the devastation was total and immediate, much as it had been in Hiroshima. The Mitsubishi armaments factories were destroyed. The great Urakami Cathedral, where Catholic worshippers had gathered that very morning, was reduced to ruins, its 2 towers toppled, some of its worshippers killed instantly within its walls. Homes, schools, and hospitals within the valley were flattened or set ablaze. It is estimated that between 35,000 and 40,000 people were killed instantly or within the first day, with the total death toll by the end of 1945 estimated at somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 people, a number that, like Hiroshima's, can never be known with complete precision. Among those affected were prisoners of war held in camps near the city, and Korean forced laborers working in the Mitsubishi factories, whose deaths, alongside the primarily Japanese civilian toll, are an often under-remembered part of Nagasaki's story, my friend, but an important one. War and its terrible weapons rarely respect the neat categories of nationality that lead to conflict in the first place. The dead of Nagasaki included the very allies and forced laborers of the empire that the war itself had set in motion. As in Hiroshima, survivors described scenes of overwhelming devastation, a blinding flash of light, followed by a thunderous blast that flattened buildings for a mile or more in the valley, followed by fires that spread through the wreckage of homes and factories. Survivors near the hypocenter suffered the same terrible burns and injuries seen in Hiroshima, and in the days and weeks that followed, the same mysterious radiation sickness began to appear among those who had survived the initial blast, striking down people who had seemed, at first, to have escaped largely unharmed. One survivor, a young medical worker named Takashi Nagai, who was himself exposed to severe radiation while working at Nagasaki's Medical College Hospital, would go on to spend much of the remainder of his shortened life caring for other survivors and writing about the bombing, eventually becoming one of the most well-known voices describing the experience of Nagasaki's hibakusha to the wider world, before his own death, attributed to radiation-related leukemia, several years after the war. Major Sweeney and the crew of Boxcar, having released their bomb with critically low fuel remaining after the diversion from Kokura, were forced to make an emergency landing on the island of Okinawa rather than returning to their base on Tinian, arriving with barely enough fuel remaining in their tanks to reach the runway. It was, in its own way, a small, strange footnote to one of the largest and most consequential missions in the history of warfare. A bombing run so close to failure due to weather and fuel that a slightly different set of circumstances might have spared Nagasaki entirely, sending the weapon instead toward some other city, or toward none at all that day. My friend, sit with that thought for just a moment if you can, without letting it trouble your rest too much. The terrible randomness by which history sometimes turns, a shift in wind or cloud cover deciding which city, which streets, which particular families would carry the weight of such a day, while others, only miles away, would not. Rest now if you need to. We have now walked together through both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, my friend, through the 2 mornings that gave this long story its name. In our chapters ahead, we will turn to what came after the days of confusion and debate in Tokyo, the emperor's unprecedented radio address, the formal surrender aboard an American battleship, and the long, slow work of rebuilding two shattered cities into the peaceful places they are today. Chapter 11: The Longest Days in Tokyo. Welcome back, my friend. Let your body settle once more into stillness. Tonight we travel to Tokyo in the days between the two bombings and the days just after, to sit quietly in the rooms where Japan's most powerful men argued, in hushed and urgent voices, over the fate of their nation. Even after the destruction of Hiroshima on August 6th, Japan's Supreme Council for the direction of the war remained deadlocked. Word of the Nagasaki bombing reached Tokyo on August 9th itself, compounding the shock, but even this second, swift blow did not immediately resolve the Council's divisions. Complicating matters further, on that very same day, the Soviet Union, which Japan had hoped might mediate a negotiated peace, instead declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria, honoring a commitment made secretly to the United States and Britain months earlier at a conference in Yalta. This Soviet entry into the Pacific War removed what little hope remained among Japan's leadership for a diplomatic path that avoided unconditional surrender. The Supreme Council remained split 3 votes to 3 on the night of August 9th into the early hours of August 10th, with Prime Minister Suzuki, Foreign Minister Togo, and Navy Minister Yanai favoring acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration's terms, provided the position of the emperor could be preserved, while War Minister Anami and the Army and Navy Chiefs of Staff continued to insist on additional conditions, including that Japan itself, rather than an occupying power, oversee any disarmament and the trial of its own war crime suspects, and that Japan not be occupied by foreign troops at all. With the council deadlocked, Prime Minister Suzuki took the extraordinary step of requesting an imperial conference, bringing the matter directly before Emperor Hirohito himself, and asking him to render what was called a sacred decision to break the impasse. This was itself a remarkable break from long-standing tradition, in which the emperor generally remained above direct political decision-making, serving as a symbolic and largely silent figure, while his ministers and generals governed in his name. In the pre-dawn hours of August 10th, in an underground bunker beneath the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito listened to the arguments on both sides, and then spoke, in a quiet, sorrowful voice, expressing his own view that the war must end, and that Japan must accept the Potsdam Declaration, with the sole condition that his own status as sovereign ruler be preserved. He spoke of the unbearable suffering the war had already inflicted on the Japanese people, and of his inability to continue asking them to endure it further. A message was sent to the Allied powers on August 10th, indicating Japan's willingness to accept the Potsdam Declaration's terms, on the understanding that they did not compromise the emperor's position as sovereign ruler. The American response, received in Tokyo on August 12th, stated that the emperor's authority would be subject to the supreme commander of the Allied powers, deliberately ambiguous language meant to satisfy both the American public's demand for unconditional surrender and Japan's insistence on preserving its imperial institution. Even this response did not end the internal Japanese debate. Military hardliners argued that the American terms were unacceptable and amounted to abolishing the imperial system in all but name. Through August 13th and into August 14th, the argument continued, even as American bombing raids resumed against Japanese cities, a grim reminder of the continuing cost of delay. On August 14th, Emperor Hirohito convened a second imperial conference and again expressed his firm wish that Japan accept the Allied terms and end the war, reportedly stating that he was prepared, if necessary, to broadcast this decision to the Japanese people himself, and even to go before the Allied forces personally to explain the decision if it would help spare his people further suffering. This second sacred decision settled the matter. That night, Japan's acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration was transmitted to the Allied powers, and preparations began for an unprecedented event. A direct radio address by the emperor to the Japanese people, who had never before, in the entire history of Japan, heard their emperor's actual voice. That same night, a small group of military officers, desperate to prevent the surrender, attempted a coup, breaking into the imperial palace grounds in an effort to seize and destroy the recording of the emperor's surrender broadcast before it could be aired, and to prevent the surrender from being announced at all. This attempted coup, known to history as the Kyujo Incident, failed by the early morning hours of August 15th, its leaders ultimately taking their own lives or being arrested. But it stands as a stark reminder of just how close Japan's military hardliners came to prolonging the war even after the emperor's own decision had been made. Rest here for a moment, my friend, in this tense, uncertain night. The decision has been made at last, though the world does not yet know it. In our next chapter, we will listen together, as the Japanese people themselves did on that August morning, to a broadcast unlike any before it. Chapter 12, The Voice of the Crane. Hello again, my friend. Rest your head once more and let me tell you about a broadcast that stopped an entire nation in its tracks. This is one of the gentler chapters in our story, though it carries its own quiet sorrow. At noon on August 15, 1945, radios across Japan crackled to life with an announcement that something of great importance was about to be broadcast. Ordinary citizens gathered around radio sets in homes, in workplaces, in public squares, many bowing formally before the broadcast began, as was customary when addressing matters concerning the emperor. Few among them knew exactly what they were about to hear, though rumors had begun to circulate that the war itself might be ending. Then, for the first time in the history of Japan, the voice of the emperor was heard directly by his people. Emperor Hirohito's recorded address, delivered in a formal, archaic court Japanese that many ordinary listeners found difficult to fully understand at first hearing, announced that Japan had accepted the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. The emperor never used the word surrender directly in his address. Instead, he spoke of the need to endure the unendurable and bear the unbearable, and explained that the war situation had, in his words, not necessarily developed to Japan's advantage. A profound understatement that has since become one of the most famous examples of diplomatic and imperial understatement in modern history. The emperor spoke, too, of the terrible new weapon that had been used against Japan, stating that the enemy had begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is, indeed, incalculable, taking the toll of many innocent lives, and that continuing the war would lead not only to the collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but to the extinction of human civilization itself. For many listeners across Japan, the broadcast produced a profound and complicated grief. Some wept openly in the streets, overwhelmed by relief that the killing and suffering, after nearly 4 years of brutal war and decades of continuous conflict in Asia beforehand, would finally end. Others wept from a different kind of anguish, feeling the shame and shock of a defeat that Japan's wartime propaganda had insisted, right up until that very moment, was neither possible nor imaginable. Some soldiers and officials, unable to bear the shame of surrender, took their own lives in the days that followed, following long-held codes of honor that equated defeat with a demand for personal atonement through death. Across the wider Pacific and across America, news of Japan's surrender, confirmed publicly by President Truman on the evening of August 14th in Washington, ahead of the emperor's own broadcast due to the time difference, was met with an eruption of joy and relief almost impossible to fully describe. Crowds filled the streets of American cities in spontaneous celebration. The photograph of a sailor kissing a nurse in Times Square, taken that very day, remains one of the most iconic images of the entire 20th century. A single frozen moment of pure, uncomplicated relief after nearly 4 years of a war that had touched almost every family in the country in some way. The formal, legal end of the war, however, still required a signed document. On September 2, 1945, aboard the American battleship USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay, representatives of the Japanese government and military formally signed the instrument of surrender, in a solemn ceremony attended by General Douglas MacArthur, who would soon become the supreme commander overseeing the occupation of Japan, along with representatives of the Allied nations who had fought in the Pacific War. General MacArthur, in brief remarks opening the ceremony, expressed his hope that from this terrible war might emerge a world founded upon faith and understanding, a world dedicated to the dignity of man. And so, my friend, on that quiet September morning, on the deck of a great battleship anchored in the very waters near where the war in the Pacific had truly begun, 4 years earlier at Pearl Harbor, the Second World War, the largest and most destructive conflict in human history, at last formally came to its end. Rest now, my friend, in the quiet that followed that long war's final ending. But our story tonight is not yet finished, for peace, once declared, does not undo what has already happened in 2 cities on the coast of Japan. In our chapters ahead, we will walk gently through the long, difficult work of what came after, the American occupation, the slow discovery of the full human cost of the bombings, and the remarkable, patient rebuilding of Hiroshima and Nagasaki into the peaceful cities they are today. Chapter 13, A Different Kind of Occupation. Welcome back, my friend. Let your eyes stay closed, your breathing slow and even, as we step now into a Japan unlike any that had existed before, a nation defeated, occupied, and in ways few could have predicted, about to be transformed. In the weeks following the surrender ceremony aboard the Missouri, Allied forces, overwhelmingly American, began arriving in Japan to begin what would become a nearly 7-year occupation, lasting until 1952. General Douglas MacArthur, given the title Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, effectively governed Japan during this period, working through, rather than replacing, the existing Japanese government and civil administration, including, notably, allowing Emperor Hirohito to remain on the throne, though stripped of any claim to divine status, a decision MacArthur believed was essential to maintaining social stability and cooperation during the occupation. Many American soldiers arriving in Japan expected to encounter continued hostility or resistance, given the fierce fighting that had characterized the island-hopping campaigns and the fanatical defense of places like Okinawa and Iwo Jima. Instead, they largely found a defeated, exhausted population focused on survival amid widespread destruction, food shortages, and the daunting task of rebuilding. The transition, while not without friction and hardship, proceeded with far less violence than many had feared. The occupation brought sweeping changes to Japanese society. A new constitution, drafted with substantial American input and adopted in 1947, transformed Japan into a parliamentary democracy, guaranteed a broad range of civil liberties, granted women the right to vote for the first time, and in its famous Article 9, renounced Japan's right to maintain offensive military forces or to wage war as a means of settling international disputes. A provision that remains a defining and still debated feature of Japan's constitution to this day. Land reform broke up large agricultural estates and redistributed land to tenant farmers. Labor unions were legalized. The old system of powerful family-controlled industrial conglomerates, called zaibatsu, which had driven much of Japan's pre-war industrial and military expansion, was significantly restructured. War crimes trials, held in Tokyo beginning in 1946 and modeled loosely on the Nuremberg trials in Germany, prosecuted senior Japanese military and political leaders for crimes committed during the war, including former Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who was convicted and executed in 1948. Emperor Hirohito himself was never charged or tried, a decision that remains debated by historians to this day, made largely because American occupation authorities believed his continued authority, even in a diminished symbolic form, was necessary to secure the cooperation of the Japanese population during this fragile period of transition. Meanwhile, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki specifically, the early occupation period brought its own particular and painful set of circumstances. American occupation authorities, for a time, imposed restrictions on press coverage and public discussion of the atomic bombings and their effects, including on medical research and photographs documenting the injuries and illnesses of survivors, a policy that has been criticized by many historians as delaying both public understanding and, in some cases, appropriate medical study and care for the hibakusha in the crucial early years after the war. At the same time, American and Japanese medical researchers did begin serious scientific study of the bombing's long-term effects, most significantly through the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, established in 1947, which conducted extensive long-term studies of survivors' health, contributing enormously, over subsequent decades, to the world's scientific understanding of radiation's effects on the human body, understanding that would later prove valuable, however grimly. In fields ranging from cancer treatment to nuclear safety regulation, and even in caring for future victims of nuclear accidents, such as those at Chernobyl and Fukushima decades later. Rest now, my friend, in this uneasy, transitional time. Japan was rebuilding itself, quite literally from ashes, under the watchful eye of the very nation whose weapon had caused so much of that destruction. In our next chapter, we will turn our attention more closely and more gently to the hibakusha themselves, the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and to the particular, quiet courage it took simply to continue living in the years that followed. Chapter 14, The Hibakusha. Hello again, my friend. Come closer, in whatever way one can come closer to a story through a soft, sleepy voice in the dark. Tonight we sit with the survivors themselves, the hibakusha, and we listen, gently, to what their lives became after that single terrible morning each of them carried within them for the rest of their days. The word hibakusha means, roughly, person affected by the bomb, and it came to describe not only those who were in Hiroshima or Nagasaki on the days of the bombings themselves, but also those who entered the cities in the days immediately afterward, exposing themselves to lingering radiation while searching for family members or assisting with rescue and recovery efforts, and even children who were still in the womb at the time of the bombings, some of whom were later found to suffer developmental effects from their exposure before birth. For many hibakusha, survival brought its own long, difficult burden, separate from and sometimes even harder than the physical injuries themselves. Survivors often carried visible scars and keloid burns for the rest of their lives, and lived with a heightened, ever-present fear of cancer and other radiation-related illnesses that could emerge unpredictably, years or even decades after their exposure. Leukemia rates among survivors rose noticeably within the first decade after the bombings, and elevated rates of certain other cancers persisted for decades afterward, a slow, statistical shadow cast forward across the remainder of many survivors' lives. Perhaps just as painful for many hibakusha was the social stigma and discrimination they faced within Japanese society itself. Misunderstanding about radiation in the early post-war decades led some Japanese people to wrongly believe that radiation exposure was somehow contagious, or that it might be passed to children through inheritance in ways that made hibakusha, and particularly hibakusha women, less desirable as marriage partners. Many survivors, especially those bearing visible scars, faced difficulty finding work or marriage partners. and some chose to conceal their survivor status entirely for much of their lives, carrying their memories privately, without the comfort of open acknowledgement or community support that might otherwise have eased their burden. Among the hibakusha, one story in particular has traveled far beyond Japan's borders, told and retold to children around the world. The story of a young girl named Sadako Sasaki. Sadako was just 2 years old, living about a mile from the hypocenter, when the Hiroshima bomb was dropped. She survived the initial blast seemingly unharmed and grew into a healthy, athletic child. But at the age of 11, nearly 10 years after the bombing, she was diagnosed with leukemia, which doctors and her family attributed to her radiation exposure as a toddler. While hospitalized, Sadako began folding paper cranes, inspired by a Japanese tradition holding that a person who folds 1,000 origami cranes will be granted a wish. She hoped, by folding her cranes, to wish for recovery, and later, as her condition worsened, for a more universal wish for peace. Sadako died in October of 1955 at the age of 12. Accounts differ as to exactly how many cranes she completed before her death, but her story inspired her classmates and, eventually, people across Japan and around the world to raise funds for a memorial. Today, a statue of Sadako holding a golden crane stands in the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park, and children from around the world continue to send folded paper cranes to Hiroshima each year, in her memory and in hope for a world without nuclear weapons. Other hibakusha channeled their experience into public testimony, speaking, often at great personal emotional cost, about what they had witnessed and endured, hoping that first-hand testimony might help ensure such weapons would never be used against human populations again. Organizations of hibakusha, such as Nihon Hidankyo, founded in 1956, became powerful advocates for nuclear disarmament on the world stage, a role that continued for decades and which was recognized in 2024, many decades after the bombings, when Nihon Hidankyo was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for its tireless efforts to bear witness and to advocate for a nuclear-free world. My friend, as the hibakusha themselves have so often said, their deepest hope was never simply to be remembered as victims, but to ensure that their suffering might serve some purpose, that by speaking plainly and honestly about what a single bomb had done to their cities and their bodies, they might help the world understand, in a way that statistics and strategy briefings never could, exactly what is at stake whenever such weapons are considered for use again. Rest now, my friend, and let their quiet courage settle gently over you like a blanket of paper cranes, folded one by one, each carrying its own small private hope. In our next chapter, we will watch as Hiroshima itself, slowly and patiently, rose again from its ashes, choosing to become not a monument to destruction, but a global city of peace. Chapter 15: Ashes and Green Shoots. Welcome back, my friend. Let your body grow heavy and soft again against the bed. Tonight, we watch something quiet and remarkable happen, slowly, over months and years. A city rising gently back to life. In the immediate aftermath of the bombing, some scientists and observers, both Japanese and American, wondered whether Hiroshima's soil had been so poisoned by radiation that nothing would grow there again for many years, perhaps even decades. This fear turned out, thankfully, to be unfounded. Within weeks of the bombing, green shoots of grass and weeds began pushing up through the blackened rubble and ash, and by the following spring, oleander flowers, which would later be named the official flower of the city of Hiroshima, bloomed among the ruins, an early and hopeful sign that the land itself, at least, had not been permanently destroyed. The human work of rebuilding, however, would take far longer and require far more effort than the quiet resilience of grass and flowers. In the immediate months after the bombing, survivors in Hiroshima faced desperate conditions. Shortages of food, clean water, and medical supplies, combined with the enormous physical task of clearing rubble and the emotional task of searching for and often failing to find missing family members. Temporary shacks and shelters rose amid the ruins as displaced residents tried to re-establish some semblance of ordinary life. In 1949, the Japanese national government passed a special law, the Hiroshima Peace Memorial City Construction Law, designating Hiroshima as a city of peace and providing special support and funding for its reconstruction, distinct from ordinary Japanese municipal redevelopment. This reflected a deliberate choice, made by city leaders and embraced over time by much of Hiroshima's population, that the city's reconstruction would center around a message of peace and an appeal for the abolition of nuclear weapons, rather than simply rebuilding as though nothing had happened or emphasizing only its own suffering. At the heart of this vision was the creation of the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park, built in the area of the city that had been the bustling Nakajima commercial district before the bombing, directly beneath the point where Little Boy had detonated. The park, designed by the architect Kenzo Tange, who would go on to become one of the most celebrated architects of post-war Japan, opened in stages through the 1950s and includes the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, which documents the events and aftermath of the bombing through photographs, artifacts, and survivor testimony, and the Memorial Cenotaph, an arched stone monument that frames in the distance. A single preserved ruin left, deliberately standing amid the surrounding modern city. That ruin is the building now known as the Hiroshima Peace Memorial, though it is more commonly called the Atomic Bomb Dome. Before the bombing, it had been the Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall, a distinctive building with a European-style domed roof, standing almost directly beneath the blast. Remarkably, because the bomb detonated almost directly above the building, its central dome and some of its walls remained standing amid the surrounding devastation, its skeletal iron dome frame silhouetted against the sky. Rather than demolishing this haunting ruin, the city chose, after considerable debate, to preserve it exactly as it stood, as a permanent physical reminder of the bombing. It was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1996 and remains, to this day, one of the most recognizable and moving images associated with the atomic bombings. Hiroshima's economic recovery, alongside its physical and symbolic reconstruction, proceeded steadily through the 1950s and 1960s, part of the broader Japanese post-war economic recovery that would eventually make Japan one of the largest economies in the world. By the 1960s, Hiroshima had grown into a modern industrial city once again, home to automobile manufacturing and other major industries, its population far surpassing pre-war levels, its streets once again filled with the ordinary rhythms of urban Japanese life, its streetcars, remarkably, including several vehicles that had survived the bombing itself and were repaired and returned to service. Still running along routes their predecessors had traveled on that August morning in 1945. Every year since 1947, Hiroshima has held a peace memorial ceremony on the morning of August 6th at 8:15, the exact moment of the bombing, attended by the city's mayor, survivors, dignitaries from Japan and around the world, and increasingly in recent decades, representatives of nuclear-armed nations invited specifically to bear witness to the human consequences of the weapons their own countries continue to maintain. A bell is rung, a moment of silence is observed, and doves are released into the summer sky above a city that chose, deliberately and with great collective effort, to make remembrance and the pursuit of peace its central purpose in the world. Rest now, my friend, in this slow unfolding of renewal. In our next chapter, we will travel south once more to see how Nagasaki, in its own way and in its own time, undertook this same long journey of rebuilding. Chapter 16, The Harbor Remembers. Hello again, my friend. Let your breathing find its slow rhythm once more. Tonight we return to Nagasaki, that hillside city of shipyards and church bells, to see how it too found its way back toward ordinary life. Nagasaki's path to recovery shared much in common with Hiroshima's, though it unfolded with its own distinct character, shaped by the city's particular geography and its long, unusual history as a crossroads between Japan and the wider world. Because the hills surrounding the Urakami Valley had partially shielded the city's traditional downtown and harbor areas from the direct force of the blast, portions of Nagasaki's pre-war character survived more intact than was the case in Hiroshima, even as the Urakami district itself lay in ruins. As in Hiroshima, the Japanese national government eventually passed special reconstruction legislation for Nagasaki, the Nagasaki International Culture City Construction Law, enacted in 1949 alongside the similar law for Hiroshima, providing dedicated support for rebuilding the city with an emphasis, in Nagasaki's case, on its identity as a city of international and cultural exchange, reflecting its centuries-old role as a bridge between Japan and the outside world. The rebuilding of the Urakami Cathedral became a particularly meaningful undertaking for Nagasaki's Catholic community, many of whose members had died in the bombing, given the cathedral's proximity to the hypocenter. The cathedral was rebuilt in the 1950s, and a fragment of the original cathedral's bell tower, along with statues that survived the blast bearing visible scorch marks and damage, were preserved as memorials near the reconstructed church, silent witnesses standing alongside the renewed building. Nagasaki established its own peace park near the hypocenter in the Urakami Valley, featuring the Nagasaki Peace Statue, a large bronze figure with one hand pointing to the sky, symbolizing the threat of nuclear weapons, and the other extended horizontally, symbolizing peace, unveiled in 1955. A black stone pillar marks the exact hypocenter of the blast nearby, and the Nagasaki Atomic Bomb Museum, opened in 1996, documents the bombing and its aftermath much as its counterpart institution does in Hiroshima. Each year on August 9th, Nagasaki holds its own peace memorial ceremony at 11:02 in the morning, the precise moment of the bombing echoing Hiroshima's ceremony 6 days earlier on the calendar, together forming an annual pair of remembrances that mark, each summer, the anniversaries of the only 2 times in human history that nuclear weapons have been used against human populations in war. One particular figure looms large in Nagasaki's post-war memory, Dr. Takashi Nagai, whom we met briefly in an earlier chapter. Despite suffering from radiation-induced leukemia himself, Nagai spent his remaining years, until his death in 1951, writing extensively about the bombing and its aftermath, and advocating for peace. His writings, including a widely read book called The Bells of Nagasaki, helping to shape how both Japan and the wider world came to understand and remember the bombing of his city. His small writing hut, called Nyakodo, still stands in Nagasaki today, preserved as a modest memorial to his life and work. Both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, over the decades since 1945, developed into what are sometimes called sister cities of peace, sending joint delegations to international forums, jointly advocating for nuclear disarmament, and welcoming millions of visitors from Japan and from around the world, who come to learn about the bombings and to reflect on their consequences. Numerous foreign leaders, including sitting American presidents in more recent years, have visited the memorial parks of both cities, laying wreaths at the cenotaphs and meeting with aging hibakusha, whose numbers, inevitably, grow smaller with each passing year. Both cities today are, by any ordinary measure, thriving modern Japanese cities. Hiroshima known for its automobile industry, its beloved professional baseball team, and its position as a major regional hub. Nagasaki known for its shipbuilding heritage, its distinctive blend of Japanese and Western architectural influences, and its dramatic harbor views. And yet, woven into the identity of each city, inseparably, is this shared purpose: to remember clearly and honestly what happened there, and to use that memory in service of a world that might never see such a weapon used in war again. Rest now, my friend, in the quiet dignity of these two rebuilt harbor and river cities. In our chapters ahead, we will widen our view once more, looking outward to the wider world that these two bombings helped to shape. A world that soon found itself gripped by a new and different kind of danger, one measured not in single bombs, but in vast arsenals capable of ending civilization many times over. Chapter 17: A New and Nervous World. Welcome back, my friend. Settle in once more and let your thoughts drift outward now, beyond Japan, to the wider world that had just witnessed, for the first time, what a single bomb could do. In the years immediately following the end of the Second World War, the United States stood alone as the world's only nuclear power, possessing knowledge and capability that no other nation on Earth could yet match. This brief period of American nuclear monopoly shaped much of the early tension of what would soon be called the Cold War, the long ideological and geopolitical standoff between the United States and its allies on one side, and the Soviet Union and its allies on the other, a standoff that would dominate international affairs for the next 4.5 decades. That monopoly did not last long. The Soviet Union, through a combination of its own scientific research, and notably through espionage that successfully obtained key details of the American bomb design, tested its own first atomic weapon in August of 1949, far earlier than most American analysts had predicted. The news stunned Washington and accelerated an arms race that would, over the following decades, come to define much of global politics. In 1952, the United States tested the first hydrogen bomb, a fusion weapon of vastly greater destructive power than the fission weapons used against Hiroshima and Nagasaki, capable of yields measured not in thousands, but in millions of tons of TNT equivalent. The Soviet Union followed with its own hydrogen bomb test within a few years. Britain, France, and China each developed their own nuclear arsenals over the following 2 decades, and other nations, including India, Pakistan, and later North Korea, would eventually join what came to be known, with grim understatement, as the nuclear club. Throughout the 1950s, 1960s, and beyond, the world lived under what strategists came to call the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, an almost paradoxical idea suggesting that peace between the great nuclear powers could be maintained precisely because each side possessed enough weapons to utterly destroy the other, and indeed much of human civilization, in the event of a full nuclear exchange, making such a war, in theory, an irrational and unthinkable choice for any rational leader to make. This fragile balance was tested most dramatically in October of 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the discovery of Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba, within easy striking range of the United States, brought the two superpowers closer to actual nuclear war than at any other point during the entire Cold War. For 13 tense days, the world watched as American and Soviet leaders negotiated, through direct and indirect channels, a resolution that ultimately saw the missiles withdrawn from Cuba in exchange for a secret American commitment to remove its own missiles from Turkey, along with a public pledge not to invade Cuba. Schoolchildren across America and other nations during these decades grew up conducting duck-and-cover drills, practicing hiding beneath their desks in the event of a nuclear attack, a practice that, in hindsight, offered little genuine protection against the weapons of that era, but which reflected the very real and pervasive anxiety that shaped daily life for an entire generation raised under the shadow of the mushroom cloud. Gradually, over subsequent decades, the world's nuclear powers, recognizing the catastrophic and ultimately unwinnable nature of nuclear war, began pursuing arms control agreements aimed at limiting and eventually reducing their arsenals. The Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963 ended atmospheric nuclear testing among its signatories. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, opened for signature in 1968, sought to prevent the further spread of nuclear weapons to additional nations, while committing existing nuclear powers to eventual disarmament. Later treaties between the United States and Soviet Union, and later Russia, progressively reduced the enormous stockpiles that had accumulated during the height of the Cold War, stockpiles that had, at their peak in the 1980s, numbered well over 60,000 nuclear warheads worldwide. And yet, my friend, even as these arsenals were reduced from their Cold War peak, nuclear weapons never disappeared from the world. Thousands remain held by 9 nations, even to this day. Decades after that August morning in 1945, when the first, and so far, only such weapons were used in war. The story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in this sense, is not simply a story about the past. It is a story that continues, quietly and urgently, into our own present moment, every single time the leaders of nuclear-armed nations must decide, again and again, not to use the weapons they still hold in readiness. Rest now, my friend, beneath the weight of this long shadow. It is a heavy thing to carry into sleep, I know, but there is comfort, too, in knowing how many decades have now passed without these weapons being used again, and in knowing how many people, including the Hibakusha themselves, have devoted their lives to ensuring that peace continues. In our next chapter, we will turn to the long historical debate that has continued ever since 1945, among historians, veterans, and citizens alike, about whether the bombings were necessary and whether they achieved what their planners intended. Chapter 18, a question without an easy answer. Hello again, my friend. Rest here a while longer with me. Tonight's chapter asks a question that historians, veterans, philosophers, and ordinary citizens have argued over for more than 80 years now. A question with no single, simple answer, though I will try to walk you gently through its many sides. Was it necessary to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? At the time, and for years afterward, the dominant view in the United States, expressed by President Truman himself, and by many of the military planners involved, held that the bombings were necessary to end the war quickly and to avoid a costly invasion of the Japanese home islands. An invasion that, as we discussed earlier, military planners feared could cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties, and quite likely, far more Japanese casualties still, both military and civilian. Given the pattern of fierce resistance seen at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, writing several years after the war, argued that the bombings, while terrible, ultimately saved lives on balance by bringing the war to an end without the invasion that had been planned for the autumn of 1945 and beyond. This view, sometimes summarized as the traditional or orthodox interpretation, remained the dominant public understanding in the United States for decades after the war. Yet from very early on, other voices, including some prominent American military leaders themselves, expressed doubts about whether the bombings were truly necessary to end the war on acceptable terms. General Dwight Eisenhower, who would later become president, recalled expressing to Secretary Stimson his own belief, even before the bombings occurred, that Japan was already defeated and that the bombing was unnecessary. Fleet Admiral William Leahy, Truman's own chief of staff, wrote after the war that in his opinion the use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in the war against Japan, and that the Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender. Historians who question the necessity of the bombings point to several pieces of evidence. That Japan's leadership, as we saw in earlier chapters, was already engaged in tentative diplomatic efforts to seek a negotiated end to the war before either bombing occurred, that Japan's navy had been effectively destroyed, and its economy was collapsing under the weight of a tightening American blockade and continued conventional bombing, and that the Soviet Union's entry into the war on August 9th, occurring on the very same day as the Nagasaki bombing, may have been at least as significant a factor in Japan's final decision to surrender as the bombs themselves, by eliminating any remaining hope that Moscow might help broker a negotiated peace, and by opening a new front against Japanese forces in Manchuria and Korea that Japan had no remaining capacity to resist. Others, defending the traditional view, point out that despite these factors, Japan's Supreme Council remained genuinely and severely deadlocked even after both bombings, and that it took the emperor's own direct and unprecedented intervention, not once but twice, to break that deadlock, suggesting that Japan's military hardliners might well have continued to resist for some additional period even without the bombs, given their demonstrated willingness throughout the Pacific War to continue fighting despite overwhelming odds and mounting losses. Still, other historians and commentators have questioned not simply whether the bombings hastened surrender, but whether their use against cities with substantial civilian populations, rather than more isolated military or industrial targets, or whether a demonstration of the weapon on an uninhabited location before its use against a populated city might have achieved a similar strategic effect while avoiding, or at least reducing, the immense civilian casualties that resulted. Proponents of the decisions actually made at the time have responded that such a demonstration carried significant risks of its own, including the possibility of a technical failure that might have undermined the credibility of the threat entirely, and the reality that only two weapons existed and had been fully prepared for use by August of 1945, complicating any strategy that involved holding one in reserve for a demonstration. Some historians have also raised the question of whether racial attitudes toward the Japanese, hardened by years of brutal Pacific fighting and by wartime propaganda on both sides that often dehumanized the enemy, made the decision to use the weapon against Japan, rather than, hypothetically, against Germany had the bomb been ready earlier in the war, an easier decision for American leadership to reach, a question that remains a difficult and uncomfortable thread within the broader historical debate. My friend, I share all of these different perspectives with you not to give you a single tidy answer, because no such single answer truly exists, and thoughtful, well-informed people continue to disagree about this question even now, more than 80 years after the events themselves. What can be said with much greater confidence, I think, is this: the decision was made amid extraordinary pressure, exhaustion, and uncertainty by human beings who did not have the benefit of the hindsight that we, tonight, resting comfortably and safely so many decades later, now possess. And whatever judgment history ultimately renders on the necessity of that decision, the suffering experienced by the ordinary people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was real, immense, and largely borne by civilians who had no voice whatsoever in the decisions, made far away in Tokyo and in Washington, that shaped the final days of their lives. Rest now, my friend, with this complicated, unresolved question settling quietly in your mind. Some questions, I think, are meant to be carried gently rather than solved completely. In our chapters ahead, we will look at how this story has been remembered, taught, and told across the generations since, and how the cities themselves and the wider world continue to grapple with its meaning even today. Sleep now if you are ready, and we will continue again soon. Chapter 19, Passed Down Like a Quiet Inheritance. Welcome back, my friend. Let your thoughts soften again as we look now at how this story has traveled forward through time, carried by books, films, classrooms, and quiet family conversations across the many decades since 1945. In Japan, the memory of the atomic bombings became woven deeply into the national identity, and particularly into peace education taught to schoolchildren across the country. Japanese students, for generations now, have grown up learning about Hiroshima and Nagasaki not merely as historical events, but as the foundation of Japan's post-war identity as a nation committed, at least in its official principles, to pacifism, embodied in the war-announcing Article 9 of its Constitution that we touched on earlier. School trips to the peace memorial parks in Hiroshima and Nagasaki remain a common and formative experience for Japanese children, many of whom hear direct testimony from aging hibakusha, an experience that grows rarer and more precious with each passing year, as fewer survivors remain able to share their memories firsthand. One of the most widely read accounts of the bombing, both within Japan and internationally, is a graphic novel and later anime series called Barefoot Gen, created by Keiji Nakazawa, himself a survivor of the Hiroshima bombing as a young child. Drawing on his own memories and family experience, Nakazawa's work presents the bombing and its brutal aftermath with unflinching, sometimes shocking directness, and has introduced generations of readers, particularly younger readers, both in Japan and abroad, to the human realities of the bombing in a way that more formal historical accounts sometimes cannot achieve. Outside Japan, one of the most influential early accounts came from the American journalist John Hersey, whose long-form article simply titled Hiroshima, published in the New Yorker magazine in August of 1946, just 1 year after the bombing, told the stories of 6 survivors in careful, restrained, deeply human prose. The article was so significant that the entire issue of the magazine was devoted to it alone, an almost unprecedented editorial decision, and it was quickly published as a book that has never gone out of print since. Hersey's work is widely credited with bringing the human reality of the bombing's aftermath to American and international audiences in a way that official government statements and news coverage, focused largely on the weapon's military and strategic significance, had not. Over the following decades, the story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki has appeared in countless additional forms, documentary films drawing on the extensive newsreel and photographic record, museum exhibitions, including a notable and controversial planned exhibition of the Enola Gay itself at the Smithsonian Institution in the 1990s, which sparked intense public debate in the United States over how the bombing should be remembered and interpreted. Academic historical studies examining the decision-making process from every conceivable angle, and countless works of fiction, poetry, and art created by both Japanese and international artists grappling with the meaning and legacy of nuclear weapons. Survivor testimony itself, collected and preserved through extensive oral history projects in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, has become an increasingly urgent priority in recent years, as the youngest hibakusha, those who were infants or very young children in 1945, now enter their 80s and 90s, and the number of living survivors able to share first-hand memory grows smaller with each passing year. Both cities, along with various universities and peace organizations, have undertaken efforts to record video testimony, and in some cases to train what are called memory keepers, younger volunteers who learn survivors' stories in great detail and commit to retelling them faithfully once the survivors themselves are no longer able to do so, ensuring that first-hand memory, even once no living witness remains, continues to be carried forward by dedicated human voices rather than fading into abstraction. My friend, this passing down of memory, from survivor to memory keeper, from grandparent to grandchild, from textbook to student, from documentary to viewer, is itself a quiet and remarkable act of care, is it not? A whole society, and in many ways an entire world, choosing again and again, generation after generation, not to let this story fade away, but to keep carrying it forward gently so that its lessons are not lost to time. Rest now, my friend, and let this long chain of memory settle over you like a favorite worn quilt, patched and repaired many times over the years, but never quite discarded. In our next chapter, we will look at where Hiroshima and Nagasaki stand today in our own present moment, and at the ongoing work of peace that continues in their name even now. Chapter 20, Hiroshima and Nagasaki Today. Hello again, my friend. We have traveled a very long way together already, from from the black ships in Tokyo Bay in 1853, through decades of empire and war, through 2 single mornings that changed the world forever, and through 80 years of remembrance, rebuilding, and reflection. Tonight, let us rest for a while in the present moment, in the Hiroshima and Nagasaki of today. Both cities, as we have discussed, are now thriving, modern Japanese cities, home together to well over 1.5 million people, filled with universities, hospitals, shopping districts, and the ordinary rhythms of contemporary life. Visitors arriving in either city today, stepping off a train at Hiroshima or Nagasaki Station, find bustling, green, welcoming places, streetcars and buses moving through streets lined with shops and cafes, hillsides and rivers as beautiful as they were described in our earlier chapters, long before either city's name became known around the world for a very different reason. And yet, within these thriving modern cities, the memory of 1945 remains present, visible, and deliberately, carefully maintained. The atomic bomb dome still stands in Hiroshima, its skeletal frame silhouetted against the sky beside the peaceful river, exactly as it has for 80 years now, a permanent, unmistakable anchor point connecting the city's vibrant present to its most difficult morning. The peace memorial parks in both cities continue to draw millions of visitors each year, from within Japan and from around the world, many of whom leave paper cranes, flowers, or quiet moments of reflection at the cenotaphs and memorials. Each August, the anniversary ceremonies in both cities continue to draw international attention, with representatives from nations around the world, including, in recent years, ambassadors and sometimes heads of state from nuclear-armed nations, attending to lay wreaths and to hear the mayors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki deliver their annual peace declarations, statements that combine remembrance of the past with pointed, urgent calls for continued progress toward a world free of nuclear weapons. Calls that have grown, if anything, more urgent in recent years as global tensions among nuclear-armed nations have at times increased rather than decreased. The hibakusha themselves, now almost entirely in their 80s, 90s, and beyond, continue, for as long as they are able, to share their testimony with visiting students, researchers, and journalists, though their numbers diminish year by year, a fact that both cities and international peace organizations have worked urgently to address by recording and preserving their accounts for future generations, as we discussed in our previous chapter. In 2016, President Barack Obama became the first sitting American president to visit Hiroshima, laying a wreath at the memorial cenotaph and delivering remarks reflecting on the mortal impulses that led humanity to develop such weapons, and calling for a shared moral awakening that might, someday, allow for their elimination, while notably declining to offer a formal apology for the bombing itself. A decision that reflected the continued complexity and sensitivity surrounding the events even 8 decades later. In 2023, leaders of the group of 7 major economies held their annual summit in Hiroshima itself, visiting the Peace Memorial Museum together, a symbolic choice intended to underscore the ongoing relevance of the city's message to contemporary international affairs. Today, the world's roughly 12,000 remaining nuclear warheads, held primarily by the United States and Russia, with smaller arsenals maintained by China, France, Britain, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea, remain a subject of continued international concern and diplomatic effort. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, adopted by the United Nations in 2017 and entered into force in 2021, represents the most recent major international legal effort toward eventual nuclear disarmament, though it has not yet been signed by any of the nations that actually possess nuclear weapons, a reminder of how much distance remains between the aspirations voiced in Hiroshima and Nagasaki each August, and the political and strategic realities that continue to shape the world's nuclear arsenals. My friend, we are now 20 chapters into our long journey together, And there is still more of this story left to tell, more history, more memory, more reflection on what these two cities and their people continue to teach the world, even now, 80 years on. This has been a long, heavy, and important road for us to walk together tonight, and I am glad you have stayed with me this far. Close your eyes now if they are not closed already. Let your breathing settle into its slowest, most peaceful rhythm. Good night, my friend. Sleep well, sleep deeply, and know that this vast, beautiful, resilient story and you, along with it, will still be here, quietly continuing whenever you wake.